So recently I picked up my first ever Sony, and I decided to go with the A7C II. Now I've had this camera for about 3 months and I've used it extensively over that period of time, almost every single day. And I really wanted to jump into this camera and why I chose this over the multitude of other cameras that are on the line today or on the market. I've never used a Sony outside of an A7 III years and years ago, and I didn't really prefer their color science at the time or the ergonomics of the camera, and decided to go the Fuji route. And I have been with Fuji, Ricoh, Canon ever since. And up until recently, I decided to give Sony another shot. Let's talk about it. If you know me, you know I like compact cameras, so I really wanted to stay true to that compact form factor. I was really debating the Nikon ZF. When it came down to it, it was this camera and the Nikon ZF that I was really battling in my brain about which one I felt would be the better camera for me. I ultimately chose this camera because it's smaller than the ZF. I feel like it's more ergonomic as far as how it handles. I do like the dials on the ZF, but just for my usage personally, I felt like it's too large to fit in the bags that I carry daily. Oddly enough, this does fit in my Wander 3-liter sling, and for me, that is perfect. It's a camera that I can carry around every single day. It has a relatively high megapixel sensor at 33 megapixels. It does have AI autofocus and a bunch of other fancy quirks that I think are cool, that most people probably won't utilize, but I think they're cool. But ultimately, the deciding factor for me was size. Size, form factor, and how this camera feels in hand. And I'd be lying if I said it didn't have a little bit to do with how it looks as well. I also do really like this 40. I was kind of stuck between the Carl Zeiss 35 and this SE or the G40 for Sony. And I bought them both, and I ended up sending the Carl Zeiss back because one, it was a little bit slower than this 40, and two, I really like the manual aperture on there. For me, I just think, I don't know, I'm a film guy at heart, so I just love the idea of feeling like I'm doing something when I'm taking photos and not just clicking away and moving on about my business. That has also been another reason why I've always kind of had my gripes with Sony, because I used an A7 III years and years ago, and I wasn't a big fan of the color science. I didn't like the ergonomics of the camera. I didn't like the menu layout. It just felt so sterile. It felt lifeless, and that is something that I don't like in my photography personally. That's another gripe that I've had. When choosing this camera over the A7 IV, I felt like I still don't like the ergonomics of the A7 IV. I mean, it's a fantastic camera. The functions are great. I don't necessarily like the way it looks, but the way it feels in hand. I don't like the viewfinder. I know it sounds silly. I really like the left dominant viewfinder, almost on rangefinder cameras and Fuji cameras. I don't like center viewfinders because then I can't see out of this eye. If the viewfinder is directly in the center, it normally pops up. When I put it here, it blocks my vision. I can't see. If I shoot from this, I can hold it here and I can still shoot, and I can still see through this EVF. Even though it's relatively small, I can still see. If you're left eye dominant, then I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do for you. But if you're right eye dominant, you can still shoot and see your surroundings at the same time. I think that's a huge benefit, at least for me personally. I do have a lot of things I like about this camera. I have some things that I don't necessarily care for, and we can talk about them all. So hopefully I'm not rambling, and bear with me. I'll start off with some of the things that I don't necessarily like so we can just get those out of the way. This is a single card slot camera. I don't mind it because I plan on using this for fun stuff. If this was used for professional work, a dual slot is always preferable, so the A7 IV might be your best bet. I don't necessarily mind. I've personally never had a card corrupt on me in the last like 5 years, so it doesn't necessarily scare me. This does have amazing video as well, so it is a very good hybrid camera for both. Another thing I also can add to the list of I don't like is the menu layouts. I have never been a fan of Sony's menu layouts. They do have the option to create your own like short menu that I do like, but I have never been a fan of Sony menus, and that could just be because I've been a Canon Fuji guy for so long, but moving over to the menu system is just so clunky to me, and it's so like reminiscent of a computer. It just feels like it's so similar to that feel. It's just so many settings, there's so many customizations, there's so much you can do that it almost takes you away from photography. And that was one of my really big gripes early in the beginning of the Sony takeover for the market, I guess you could say. I do like the idea that you can do everything, but I also feel like you shouldn't have to be, you know, a computer engineer to operate this camera. It should just be for photographers, and I do feel like there's a lot of extra that most people don't utilize. The battery life on this thing is not the greatest. You're gonna need multiple batteries if you have this camera. Let me see. I shot this today. I'm at 70% and I used it for like 2 hours this morning. I guess that's not that bad, but the battery life is relatively low. So if you get this, you'll need new batteries. And that's really only the gripe I have. The grip is kind of big, you know what I mean? And I guess I don't know if that's a dislike because, well, the ergonomics are great. I feel like it does make the camera a little chunkier than it needs to be, but I do like the grip because you can one hand hold it and you can do everything you need to do if you're out shooting. And I do like that a lot. Another thing I love about this camera so far is it's sharp. It's so sharp. The autofocus is great. I've always said that Fuji had great autofocus and that Ricoh had great autofocus, and I've never had an issue until I used this camera and I realized that maybe the autofocus on my other cameras wasn't as good as I felt it was at the time. This thing is insane how good it autofocuses. It's so fast and it's reliable. And it's just been a pleasure to use. I have not had any issue with autofocus, not one time in the last 90 days that I've shot this camera, and it has been glorious, and I really, really appreciate that. Another thing I really enjoy is I've been using this camera solely like a Fuji camera or my everyday camera. So I haven't been editing the RAWs. I mean, I have some, but for the main part, I shoot a JPEG and I upload it, or I try to keep my workflow as simple as possible so I'm not having to constantly upload into Lightroom and Photoshop and do a lot of heavy editing because it's not professional work. I do that for my professional workflow, so I don't like the idea of doing that for my fun workflow as well. So I have been customizing my own sims, as you say, in the Sony profile, if that makes sense, which has been glorious. Every black and white image that you've seen in this video so far has been with my own black and white sim profile that I think is great. It's glorious that you can go in and save JPEGs directly like you can on other cameras, but it just makes it a little bit easier. Like currently, this is my black and white profile that I have set up, and I don't even know if you can, I'm not even focused, I probably am. But if you can see it, this is my black and white profile, and I really like the layout and how I've handled it so far. If you're interested in my black and white sim, I'll add it right here. Just take a screenshot so you can save that information. Another huge thing I like about the film sim idea on this, and unlike Fuji, is as you're looking through the viewfinder itself, you can update or change the settings for your film sim profile. How do you say film sim? We'll just say color profile, right? You can change your color profile while you're looking down the EVF, which to me makes it so much easier to dial in how you want your shot to look. Unlike Fuji, you have to go through and update your sharpness and pick a color profile and do all that in the menu, then go back to your camera and see what it looks like. Here, I can raise the highlights, lower the contrast, lower the sharpness, the tonality. I can do all of that while I'm looking down the viewfinder, and it gives me a real world, like real-time preview of what my image will look like. And I think it makes it so much easier for dialing in your shot or whatever you feel like shooting at that time. It makes it, that just, to me, that's just one more easy thing that I can worry about. Another reason I ultimately decided to go with Sony is because I have my Canon that I've been using for video work, and God, I know the Canon is, I have gripes about it, but it is a fantastic camera and it does what I need it to do. But as I lean more into video work, I wanted to have a video-based camera, and it almost didn't make sense to have a Sony video-based camera and have a Canon photo-based camera with a Fuji and then a Ricoh and just a ton of cameras and a ton of lenses that just don't get utilized. So my idea was, if I had Sony glass, G Masters, GFEs, I could easily transition them from photo to video, and I wouldn't have this huge Pelican with all of these different mount lenses in there, and it would just make my life easier to have one mount for photo video for my professional work from the video side and the photo side. So I can see myself in the future moving away from Canon and moving solely into Sony, and I think that would just lighten up my kit a lot, and it would just lighten the load overall. But my idea was for me personally to have a full frame camera that I can use for fun work and professional work and still use it interchangeably and have fun with it. The idea of having so many cameras all the time has become daunting to me. To get in my car and take 3 cameras as I leave the house just seems like such a task that's kind of unnecessary, and it has brought me away from having fun with things, right? I don't want to have to carry a camera for video and then carry a camera for you know, short shots. And then the idea of having fixed lens cameras that I've used to like really lean into, now I'm just like, doesn't really make the most sense ergonomically, especially when it's like I'm carrying a bunch of gear. I'm supposed to be having fun, but I'm so worried about how much do I have? Do I have batteries? Do I have lenses? Did I bring this? Did I bring that? And now I've pulled myself away from the fun aspect of it. And for me, that just wasn't working. And ever since I've had the Sony, I've been just carrying the Sony, and then I might carry the Ricoh here, or I'll take them interchangeably. I'll carry my Hassi or my Canon, and I'll carry the Sony. Or I'll just carry one film camera and nothing, or just a digital camera and nothing. So that idea of not just carrying everything everywhere at any time has been glorious for me, at least. I will say another thing I don't necessarily like is there's no joystick on this camera. There's no joystick, right? Most cameras have a focusing joystick. The focusing on this camera is so good that you don't necessarily need it, but if I did want to spot focus, you have to, there's a setting, and I don't really want to go into it, but you can go into a setting and you can make this a touchpad, you can say. So as you're shooting, you can use this to touch and it'll control your focus zone, which I think is cool. It's a makeup for it, but all the cameras I've used in forever have a thumb joystick right here, and not having that thumb joystick when I'm shooting has been something that does kind of give me a little bit of a hard time. Now I shoot a lot of things at 5.6 and up, so I'm not really missing shots. I don't have a shallow depth of field, and I need to focus on this singular subject. And if I was, I would probably frame it with the LCD and not just relying on the autofocus, even though the autofocus is great and I don't necessarily miss, especially if you have your subject detect on, so it's not gonna be a big deal. But I do really like the idea of having a joystick here and being able to use my thumb and kind of control where I'm focusing. Ever since I've used this camera, I did decide to sell my Fuji and move on to this solely. I no longer have any Fuji cameras, and that is so sad to me, but it's also been so freeing because it has allowed me to move into a different workflow and a different challenge when it comes to making photographs. When I leave the house, I don't have the same sims that I relied on or the same like camera feeling. Now I find myself having to really learn how to use a new camera. I feel like I'm almost in the infancy stages of having a camera again, right? Where I'm like, oh, where is this dial? What does this dial do? What does the front dial do? How does this work? So I'm like so much more intentional about shooting when I'm out, and I'm not relying on comfortability, which has been a challenge, but it's also been fun because it's like this breath of fresh air that has been released into my photography. So now when I leave, I'm more hands-on. And that was always the thing that I was really worried about coming into the Sony. Was I've always felt that it felt sterile. So the idea of just like this nonchalant, just going through the motion shooting, I was kind of like nervous that that would happen to me. So the idea that I've been able to really be slow and methodical and thought out and frame and, you know, rely on the camera and really use it to its full potential has been great. And I really look forward to continuing that and seeing where it takes me. So I hope I didn't forget anything, but if I did, drop a comment, I'll reply. If you're curious about this camera at all, ask me in the comments below. Thank you guys for watching. Do me a favor, hit that like button. I always appreciate you guys for being here, showing love and hanging out. And until next time, be easy.